Welcome to ParaMOOC 2019. As you know, this is the Parapsychology Research and Education annual course. This year's topic is Survival of Death and Parapsychology. The live session started on April 6th and end on next Sunday, a week from today. A week from today, on May 19th. But if you're registered by May 31st, so a word to any of your friends or colleagues who might want to come into the course. If you enroll before May 31st, all of the materials will be available until April of 2020. I'd like to say thank you to Radiant Skies, the artist on 123rf.com, from whom we licensed our ParaMOOC series Moodle, ParaMOOC series Wordle as our logo some years ago. I'd also like to say thank you to Lisa Coley, the president of the Parapsychology Foundation, who supports us financially in our work in this course, and also Brian Williams from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who's the research director of the Psychical Research Foundation and our intrepid co-moderator for our discussion forums. Today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Michael Nahm. The title of his talk is The Unexpected Return of Mental Clarity Before Death, Examples, Implications, and Future Research Perspectives of Terminal Lucidity. Dr. Michael Nahm is a research associate at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology and Mental Health, also known as the IGPP, in Freiburg, Germany. His parapsychology-related research interests include unusual phenomena in near-death studies, enigmas of evolution, physical mediumship, and the history of parapsychology. He has co-authored or authored more than 100 publications in scientific journals and other research outlets, and published 2 books in German, one of them on terminal lucidity and the other on the near-death phenomena. Today's talk, Terminal Lucidity, concerns an unexpected return of mental clarity and memory shortly before death in patients suffering from severe psychiatric and neurological disorders. The most remarkable cases are reported from people whose diseases involve destruction of brain tissue, as in, for example, tumors, strokes, and Alzheimer's disease. In this presentation, Dr. Nahm will provide an overview on the phenomenology of terminal lucidity, discuss its relation to other phenomena reported from near-death states, and introduce current and future research perspectives. So let me pop over to your PowerPoint, and I'll get out of your way. You have the floor.
Okay. So, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to present this this talk on terminal lucidity in the frame of the ParaMOOC. I've just noted my title is not exactly the same as I sent you before, but anyway, the topics are the same. I will talk about terminal lucidity, and in that I will present an overview, a contextualization of these matters, and also an outlook and the mentioned current and future research perspectives. Okay, so now I click on this and it works. Okay, a few words about me in the beginning. I'm a biologist and I've also worked in the forestry science area, but I've also had a passion ever since regarding unsolved riddles of biology, of evolution. And if you are concerned with these issues, you sooner or later stumble across parapsychology, and the more I learned about it, the more fascinating I found what people do and research in parapsychology. And this resulted sooner or later in the first book, which you see here. And the next step is, if you are concerned with parapsychological issues, sooner or later, again, you find that many phenomena are specifically reported from near-death states. That seems to be an attractor for strange, peculiar, anomalous phenomena, perhaps due to the intensity of the emotional states that are usually involved in terminal states of existence. So, because I was actually working as a biologist, not as a parapsychologist, also not in a medical setting, I predominantly performed literature studies, and I found it very interesting to study the older literature, for example, of the 19th century, And it seems to me that that was a time when science disciplines were just beginning to thrive and beginning to consolidate. So people just collected material, collected stuff, and were interested in everything. There was not a strict distinguishing between proper science and pseudoscience. So you find very interesting stuff in that older literature, also in the medical journals. And this is why I stumbled across terminal lucidity again, and especially physicians and authors of the Romantic and post-Romantic era. They were concerned with these phenomena, but also many mainstream physicians of that time, and they all discussed it in terms of survival. So that again, or that already relates to the topic of this ParaMOOC talk, and the whole series of talks. Okay. Yeah, Nan has already mentioned it. I work at the research, I am research associate at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology and Mental Health in Freiburg. It was founded in 1950 by the most influential German parapsychologist in Germany, Hans Bender. All right. Now, a presentation outline. I will start with presenting an overview of terminal lucidity and give you several examples so that you know what it's all about, also in a very concrete way. Then I will insert kind of an excursus into near-death visions, sometimes also called deathbed visions, but I like that term better. And we'll then talk about possible explanatory models of terminal lucidity, and in that context we'll also talk about other unusual brain-related findings and consciousness-related enigmas. And towards the end I will discuss the already mentioned recent studies and developments in the context of studies into terminal lucidity. Right, let's begin with an overview on terminal lucidity. What is terminal lucidity? You've read it perhaps already in the abstract. Nan has also just read something about it. Well, it can be defined as the unexpected return of mental clarity shortly before dying. And this, of course, implies that the people who experience episodes of terminal lucidity have previously been in a state of mental disorder. Otherwise, they could not become clear. I think that's evident. So, what's the motivation? Why should somebody study these strange incidents? I think many good reasons for doing it. Death concerns everybody, and sooner or later you will be confronted yourself or even within your family. And many questions surround death and the dying process, but it is a kind of a taboo topic in Western societies. What is more, unusual phenomena are particularly suited for expanding our knowledge about, for example, the human mind. So this is why I always like to study unusual phenomena, parapsychology and stuff. And I think there are very good reasons for taking them seriously and to highlight research possibilities. Okay, so as mentioned already, I performed literature studies in the beginning, and the most cases of terminal lucidity were usually reported from the first half of the 19th century. And already in 1828, there was a famous German physician, Carl Friedrich Burdach, who discussed terminal lucidity. It had not that wording by then, but he already stressed that this can manifest in two subtypes, if you like. In the first subtype, terminal lucidity happens rather suddenly and unexpectedly. And in the second type, it occurs rather slowly, and it seems to be correlated to the weakening of the body in the sense that the weaker the body of a diseased or a sick person gets, the clearer the mind can turn. And these two types of terminal lucidity seem to correspond to psychiatric and neurologic disorders. For example, in the first case, in psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia and what was formerly termed affective disorders of various kinds, these are the cases in which a slow increase of mental clarity is more typical in correspondence to the decline of the bodily fitness. And the second type, in which terminal lucidity happens quite unexpectedly and suddenly, this is interestingly the group of diseases or disorders with a neurological or even a material background in which the brain really is destroyed or suffers from all different types of diseases and or disconnections of existing neuronal structures. And these are, in my opinion, also the more interesting cases. And this is why in my talk, I will also focus on these cases of the second group here. Okay. What about the incidence of terminal lucidity? How frequent does it occur? I found only very few information on that question. And you see it's already rather scattered through the centuries. The first source is also a very old source of two physicians who ran an asylum with for patients with mental disorders, and they documented the mental state of the patients who died in their asylum throughout, I think, several decades. And recorded what happened. And so these two authors already in 1844 found that in the 139 patients who died in that period, 18 of them displayed a considerably improved mental state. And they added that sometimes that occurred also rather suddenly, for example, if a stroke was involved. Then 150 years later, that's quite a distance, Peter Fenwick and his team, they performed several studies into what they called end-of-life phenomena. They reported, for example, that out of 10 carers, 7 in a nursing home, they reported that they have witnessed incidents of terminal lucidity during the last 5 years before the questionnaire was submitted to them. And again, around the same time, from Sandy McLeod in New Zealand, she reported that out of 100 patients who died in a hospice in New Zealand, 6 displayed what she termed lightening up. So this is equal to terminal lucidity in my terminology. So you see, terminal lucidity happens not that often, but it does happen regularly. And this table now shows kind of the distributions of the cases that I found in my literature study. Here is, in this column, I listed the years and 50-year intervals, and you can already see here that the most cases were reported from the early days of the 19th century, and often they concerned affective disorders and these types of diseases, and many of them were published in medical journals of that time. Then in the 20th century, you find comparably few cases. They were usually published in the parapsychological or spiritual literature, hardly in the medical literature anymore. Only since the year 2000, a slight increase in the medical literature is to be found. And this interestingly concerns mostly dementia patients and Alzheimer's patients, thanks to Peter Fenwick, who pointed to these phenomena in the recent years. And I've received also a number of personal accounts of terminal lucidity from people who know that I'm interested in that stuff. And you see that again, Alzheimer's disease and dementia patients are by far the most from which these episodes are reported. They seem to come from all over the world: Denmark, Germany, France, Iceland, New Zealand, Russia, UK, and also the USA. And I suppose it happens also in the other countries, but it's just not reported yet. All right, so now let's turn to some representative case examples. This case concerns meningitis, which is a disease that does already affect and destroy areas of the brain cortex if it is a very severe form. And the case was reported by Carlis Osis and Erlendur Haraldsson already some time ago. These two authors performed one of the first studies into end-of-life experiences. And in that context, they also came across this case. It's a woman in her 30s. She was severely disorientated, drowsy. She talked incoherently, but she still came to herself a few minutes before her death. She cleared up, answered questions, she even smiled and seemed in a slightly elated mood before she then died. This is an old case again, 1822, reported from Dr. Pfeiffer, concerns brain abscesses. And in that case, a 17-year-old young man who had, as a boy, fallen on his forehead and injured it. A long nail penetrated his skull. And throughout the years, he developed increasing mental disorders. He lost his memory. He developed mental disturbances, claimed to have a constant and increasing headache. He was at one point bedridden and could not stand up. Each time he stood up, he had to throw up. And he was finally administered into a hospital. And in this hospital, he stayed in that very bad condition for 18 days. And then all of a sudden, on the 19th day, the physician who came to visit him found him out of bed. He was walking around the room. He claimed to be perfectly clear, no pain, no sickness, and he made plans to leave the hospital very soon to pick up his studies again. But after 50 minutes, he collapsed and died. And the autopsy showed that in his brain there were 2 large pus-filled bags, tissue bags, which were obviously also the cause for his previous mental disturbances and also his death, presumably. This is a recent case reported by US Dr. Scott Hagg, concerns a man who had cancer that had already spread into his brain, so that he lost his ability to speak or to move and fell at one point unconscious. And according to Scott Hagg, the last brain scan showed that his brain was almost completely destroyed. Whatever that means, I don't know, but that's what he said. Anyway, this man woke up suddenly one day. The family was standing at his bedside, and he said his goodbye to his family members. He smiled, he petted them, spoke with them for about 5 minutes, and then he lost consciousness again and died about 1 hour later. Turning now to cases of Alzheimer's disease. I have several of them in my collection, and this is a case that was reported to me in person from a friend of mine whom I know since many years, and it concerns his grandmother, who was at that time 91 years old, and she already had the Alzheimer's disease for 15 years. She didn't recognize her daughters who cared for her for 5 years already, and it was practically not possible to communicate with her in one way or another. But suddenly, one evening, she recognized her daughters. Well, she lived at the house of one daughter, and the other was just for a visit, also present. And then she began a normal conversation with her daughters about fear of dying, about the problems she had with the church, and she inquired about the well-being of several family members. And she just seemed perfectly normal. And still, in the night, she then died. And this was a very peculiar experience for the 2 daughters, and they really did not know what happened and how to react, and were actually rather frightened and confused. Another Alzheimer's case, this time it was reported by Erlendur Haraldsson. I've mentioned him already earlier, but in this case, it's not from a study that he performed, but it concerned a former colleague of his at the university in Iceland, or the wife of his colleague. It concerns an 81-year-old woman in this case, who also had Alzheimer's disease for many years, bedridden, non-responsive, kind of a typical end stage, terminal stage of that disease. She hadn't spoken anything since about 1 year and recognized nobody. Still, she was in a hospital, and the family members regularly sat at her bedside and just spent time with her. So in that case, it was her son who sat at her bedside and did some crossword stuff. I don't know the word now. But suddenly she sat up, looked directly into his eyes, and then she said to him, my leader, so that's the name of her son, I'm going to recite a verse to you. And then she said, O Father of light, be adored. Life and health you gave to me, my father and my mother. Now I sit up, for the sun is shining. You send your light into me. O God, how good you are. And then she laid back on her pillow and became non-responsive again. But in that case, she did not die immediately, but she lived for 3 more weeks. But anyway, this was a very strange happening. And the family thought that she just made up this kind of a poem, and because she was also referring to the situation that she was just being in, but they later found out it was actually a citation of an old Icelandic song that she seemed to remember from somewhere, and then to cite it as an appropriate quote for the present situation they both were in. Okay. Now, because Alzheimer's disease is a very frequent, or terminal lucidity often happens in the context of Alzheimer's disease, Rudolf Tanzi was at one point asked if he knows about, or if he has already heard about Alzheimer's disease. And Rudolf Tanzi, he is a leading neurologist at Harvard University who performed important pioneering studies into the underpinnings of Alzheimer's disease. And so when he was asked about terminal lucidity, so this is what he said. Well, the events of terminal lucidity, even in Alzheimer patients who were barely conscious, who were barely responsive, well, we hear them all the time. How suddenly a patient can, just before death, say their goodbyes to their loved ones, remembering their names, maybe recalling an event after a decade or so. It's a complete mystery. We don't really know how that's happening, but it's undeniable that it happens, and it is amazing. So that was very important at that time, that somebody from the professional medical Alzheimer's setting confirmed that these events really do occur and are not just weird anecdotes reported from the settings at home or wherever. Now, I want to highlight already at that stage that phenomena like terminal lucidity should not be regarded as an isolated phenomenon that occurs in near-death states. It has several relations to other phenomena that occur in near-death states, and this is an example highlighting all these interrelatedness of the phenomena. It was reported by a German author, Jürgen Brun, and it shows the relation, in this case, to near-death experiences. Janice Holden has talked about near-death experiences earlier. I've seen it on the program, so you know what these experiences are, I hope. And in this case here, that Brun reported, an elderly woman in a typical terminal Alzheimer's end stage, she hadn't spoken for 2 years, she suffered a cardiac arrest, but still was resuscitated, because you do it also, of course, with these patients. But quite peculiarly, she was fully conscious after she was resuscitated. And she thanked everybody for all they did in the times before. And she said she had all the time been present, but she just could not let them know, and she could not act and talk. And also this woman then died of a second cardiac arrest the following night. Another Alzheimer's case, and this time highlighting the relation to near-death visions, or sometimes also called deathbed visions, but I prefer the term near-death visions. It sounds more appropriate and also somewhat nicer. And near-death visions, they concern seeing deceased affiliates or mystical figures when they are close to death. And these figures, they seem to visit the dying, to spend comfort, or to pick them up and prepare them for the dying process. I will talk about near-death visions in a minute some more. But this case is a terminal lucidity case that was related by Raymond Moody. And it concerns an elderly patient, advanced Alzheimer's disease again. It's a man in this case who didn't recognize his children and his wife anymore. And also this person suddenly sat up in his bed with a very alert expression, and he conversed vividly with his brother. But the brother was nowhere to be seen. He was kind of an invisible apparition that only this patient could see. And they seemed to have a good time together and laughed, and Moody wrote, like they met in a cafe and talked to each other and hadn't seen each other for a longer time. But again, after this conversation, this man fell back into his old non-responsive stage and died later that day. And all people who were involved in that case, they thought the brother was still alive because they knew he was alive. So they thought, well, this person is simply hallucinating. But it turned out in the end that the brother of this Alzheimer patient had just died at the very moment they had this conversation with each other, which again is a rather peculiar coincidence. And so this case basically shows that the patient with a terminal lucidity episode in that case also had a near-death vision of his deceased brother. All right, this is just a picture from the internet, and it highlights what happens to the brain in Alzheimer patients in the terminal stages. So the left figure shows the brain of somebody who has turned old with Alzheimer's disease. And this is the brain of a normally healthy, aged individual. And you see that the brain is largely degenerated. And even the brain tissue that is still left is much more coarse and, it's damaged. And this is, of course, the reason why the person and the memories in Alzheimer patients are increasingly destroyed and become more and more absent. So the more remarkable it is that people with such brains can suddenly be almost normal again, perhaps even fully normal. Now, an example concerning strokes. Stroke is also very severe brain damage that can have many different reasons, but the end or effect is always that a larger or smaller or larger part of the brain is destroyed because it's not anymore supplied with oxygen and blood. And in this case, again, an old woman had 2 strokes. So in the end, she couldn't talk or move anymore, only her eyes. And she also lived at home and was cared for by her daughter. And one day, this daughter heard a distinct call from the room that the mother was lying in her bed. And so she hurried into that room, and she found that the usually paralyzed face of her mother smiled. And this mother also sat up in bed, raised her arms, called the name of her deceased husband, and then sank back and was dead. So also this person seems to have experienced a near-death vision. That's what is reported. I don't know if it's true. It's an anecdote, but it's very peculiar that people report such things, because a paralyzed person should obviously not be able to smile or to sit up in bed. Now there's also one case, or I've got 3 or 4 cases that concern mental disabilities, but this is the most remarkable one, and I'd also like to introduce that one to you. It's a case from Germany. It was reported by Friedrich Happich and also by a physician. Friedrich Happich was the head of a huge asylum for mentally ill persons in Germany. And he talked about Anna Katharina Ehmer, also called Käthe. And she was, according to him, one of the most disabled patients he ever had in his asylum. She was seriously disabled from birth on. She never learned to speak a single word, and she also could not move. She just lay in bed and developed uncontrolled spasms and screamed and things like this. So she was really in a bad condition. And she also never seemed to take notice of her environment and did not interact with the people around her. Still, she suffered several incidents of severe meningitis, and at one time she also suffered from tuberculosis, and she was on the verge of dying. And then the chief physician of this asylum, Wilhelm Wittneben, he at one point called his boss and said, "Hey, Friedrich, come to Käthe's room and you have to see what's happening here." And then he also went to Käthe, who was on the verge of dying. And this is what Happich then recounts. He says, Käthe, who had never spoken a single word, being entirely mentally disabled from birth on, sang dying songs to herself. Specifically, she sang over and over again, "Where does the soul find its home, its peace? Peace, peace, heavenly peace." For half an hour she sang. Her face, up to then so stultified, was transfigured and spiritualized, and then she quietly passed away. So this is really a remarkable account again, and it really impressed Happich strongly, and also Wittneben. So I, of course, again, cannot tell if that really happened like it did, but they published references and descriptions of the case of Käthe, at least in several different locations. They included it in talks, they published it in newspapers, and again, and so on. So it seems that might really have taken place. And I also checked the documents in that asylum where Käthe was supposed to have lived. And it is true that Käthe did, in fact, live there and die, and at the day that both Happich and Wittneben stated it in their various publications. So she is she lived, but I found no specific note about the circumstances of her dying in the archives of that asylum. Anyway, there are several other remarkable aspects that sometimes come along with terminal lucidity, such as the announcement of one's own death. People may suddenly clear up and also say, "I will be dying, let's say, tomorrow morning at 3 o'clock, and this will then happen." Then there are also cases that seem to resemble a previous possession. This is an indication that predominantly occurs in the psychiatric and affective disorders type. But people can, again, clear up more or less suddenly or slowly, and then excuse themselves for their bad behavior, saying, "Well, I was not able to act in a different way because I was forced by an external force to behave in that terrible manner, but I have been present all the time, and now that I'm dying, I'm finally able to express myself again," for example. Then there are also cases that entail an unusual spiritual quality in which people who come to themselves again talk about the afterlife or visions of heavenly realms they perceive, and use a language and verbs they usually never used in their normal way of talking or conversing. And as mentioned before, it's not unusual that cases of terminal lucidity involve near-death visions, and this is the reason why I think they deserve a closer look. So now I turn to my second part of the presentation and talk a little more on near-death visions. Near-death visions, I've mentioned it before, usually or typically they concern the visions of deceased relatives, friends, or mystical figures that come to comfort the dying. And a very typical explanation in neuroscientific terms is, well, that's an hallucination that the dying generate because they are in a very excited state. They have their fear of death and so on. So they generate hallucinations that comfort them, which is a natural psychological function. But again, Osis and Haraldsson, they said, well, if that's the case, that should be possible to test it, following certain assumptions or hypotheses that can be tested as it is uses in scientific theorizing. So they said, for example, if near-death visions are hallucinations, we should find more near-death visions in patients who, before dying, took strong medicines or suffered from a very high fever, because this is known to induce hallucinations. Or people who die in a mentally clear state, they should not experience so much near-death visions as compared to people who die in a mentally disturbed state, who should experience relatively more near-death visions. Or people who are known to suffer from great stress and fear of dying, they should develop more near-death visions to comfort themselves. Or people who expect to recover and still die suddenly, or more or less suddenly, this happens not too infrequently in hospital settings, they should create hallucinations about living in this life because this is what they expect and what they want. Whereas on the other hand, people who expect to die anyway, those are the ones who should generate predominantly hallucinations about the afterworld, including the deceased loved ones and so on. And of course, one should also expect that near-death visions vary according to the individual background. It should be a D, like determined by memories, by desires, by religious afterworld concepts, and so on. And so Osis and Haraldsson, they performed 2 very large studies, spreading questionnaires to all kinds of physicians and nurses that work in hospital settings. And in the first study, they received numerous feedback, thousands basically, and some of them had such a quality that they decided we should follow them up via interviews. So in the first study, they performed 150 interviews with nurses about reported near-death visions. In the second study, even 470 interviews. So this is more than 500 cases they can refer to, and these are only the cases that refer to apparitions. There are also other cases like landscapes, otherworldly realms that are not even included here. So they had quite a huge basis with which they could perform some statistics. And the interesting finding was that none of these hypotheses was confirmed. So they concluded near-death visions, they display a very characteristical momentum of their own. They seem not to be typical hallucinations. They don't have the quality that one should expect typical hallucinations to have. So near-death visions, maybe they have some objective aspects and are indicative of human survival. And what is also interesting, that also a finding that pops up in my terminal lucidity cases, near-death visions have a very comparable phenomenology in different brain disorders, but also in healthy brains. So somebody who dies with a healthy brain and somebody who dies with an Alzheimer brain experiences deathbed visions or near-death visions in basically the same manner. And this is like in terminal lucidity. The precise condition of a brain or the type of the disease, be it a stroke, be it a tumor, be it an Alzheimer, dementia disease, seems to be rather irrelevant. The terminal lucidity episode can manifest almost identically. And this raises questions with regard to the relevance of the anatomy or the biochemistry of the brain in these cases. Okay, so drawing some conclusions from that sections, near-death visions and terminal lucidity, they share a comparable phenomenology. It's not just a delirium the people enter. And because of that similarity, one could even speculate that near-death visions have a kind of a relevance for explanatory models for terminal lucidity. And of course, as mentioned before, this again highlights the interrelation of the near-death phenomena that occur in these states and often occur even in combination. So turning now to part 3 of my talk, I will speculate a bit on explanatory models for terminal lucidity. Well, if we want to develop such a model, basically we can follow 2 approaches. We can say from a neuroscientific perspective, All cases of terminal lucidity can be explained by altered brain chemistry before death. But second approach would entail the notion that at least some cases cannot be explained by the brain chemistry alone. Then there would not be a one-to-one relationship between the mind and the brain. And this is, for example, an approach that was advanced by several authors of the 19th century, especially the Romantic authors, and also in later times some parapsychological authors, and so on. So basically, the idea behind that second approach is that in these cases, the mind frees itself from the obstructing brain matter and shines again in an unobstructed quality. But these are the two possibilities, but research has hardly been performed. So at present, we cannot really go any deeper with regard to establishing facts or whatever. But and I should also mention this, because studying dying patients is of course difficult, so it will also not be easy to perform scientific research into terminal lucidity, because there are severe moral and ethical concerns. It's difficult to study somebody who's just dying, and also technically difficult because terminal lucidity is not a frequent occurrence. There's no way, as far as we know today, to estimate who is going to display such an experience or who not. So anyway, there is some recent development going on in the research community, and I will talk about that in my next part of this presentation. But for now, what we can still do is look into possibly related phenomena that are even enigmas of consciousness that might allow us to weigh a bit the two just mentioned possibilities against each other and show whether the first or the second one can be regarded as plausible. So this is why I will introduce to you several related phenomena in terms of related to unusual consciousness aspects. And I'd like to begin with a short mention of savants like Kim Peek. He was really a memory miracle. And it is estimated that towards of his life, Kim Peek memorized about 12,000 books, the contents of about 12,000 books, almost verbatim. And he read all those pages of the books only within seconds. And he just never forgot anything he ever read. And he also never forgot anything he heard, like music, melodies, and all these things. So he was really a wondrous brain, a wondrous person. And of course, researchers also wanted to know, so why does he have all that perfect brain and the perfect memory? Why don't I have it? So they scanned his brain. And what you see here, that's the scan of a normal brain. And that's the scan of Kim Peek's brain. And what is quite astonishing is that his brain looks rather deranged. So there are areas that are just filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and some areas like his, don't know in English now, the small brain part here is badly developed. The cortex areas are heavily deranged, and I mean you can see it on the image, the brain is not really beautifully developed as it should be, but still he had that perfect memory, and people just don't know how that can be possible at all. Some other peculiar phenomena. Sometimes people suffer from a disease that cannot be cured unless one hemisphere or the disease spreads into one hemisphere, and it cannot be cured in another way than removing that hemisphere. This is an image what you see here, a brain scan. That operation is typically called hemispherectomy. There are two parts of performing it. In earlier days, the brain hemisphere was really removed physically, and nowadays I think they prefer to just cut the connections between the rest of the brain, so that's only a functional cutting or disentanglement of the hemisphere, so the hemisphere would remain inside the skull but not working anymore. But This is, of course, a drastic example of what really happens. One hemisphere of the brain is just removed and not present anymore. And what is astonishing in that case, in these cases, that the people don't lose any memory. So if the people are operated, nothing, at least that's what physicians report, and the people, nothing of their memories gets lost, even if half of their cortex is removed. Then here's another interesting case, Carlos Rodriguez. You find images of him in the internet if you Google, and he suffered a brain injury at the age of 14. And you can see that lots of his brain got lost during that accident, but also he seems to be still a rather normal man. And also he says he did not lose memory after his accident, which raises questions with regard to the neurologic underpinning of memory. Other peculiar brains, you find them in investigations of hydrocephalus. Sometimes, I tell what hydrocephalus is. It's a brain condition where the cerebrospinal fluid cannot drain off, so it accumulates in the brain inside the skull. It presses the remaining or the present brain tissue towards the skull, and the result is that the brain cannot develop normally. So these 3 scans pertain to a hydrocephalus patient, and these are scans of a normal brain. You can clearly see some difference, and some patients with hydrocephalus are still rather normal despite these peculiar maldevelopments of their brain. So the large anatomy and also the fine anatomy of the brain is totally different as compared to normal brains, but still you find people who are normal or have an IQ that is even above the average of human beings. John Lorber, a British physician, has intensively worked on such cases and published several interesting accounts. And this is a publication that has just recently been issued. This is also a patient with severe hydrocephalus, was published in 2007. I show this now as a kind of a sidelight because it highlights some peculiar practices in mainstream medical science. So this hydrocephalus patient was published in 2007 in The Lancet, which is a very well-known medical journal. And here, as a comparison in the New Scientist, these pictures were published as well. It is the brain of the normal person. And then I found in my research, I found it very peculiar that 5 years later, a Brazilian team of authors published a second case or another case of remarkable hydrocephalus from Brazil, unpublished data, new case. And on close inspection, I seem to notice that the pictures look rather similar, if not identical. And in fact, after all, it turned out that it was simply a mere plagiarism. The Brazilian team simply copied and pasted these images from the New Scientist website and put it into their paper, which they published in also a very renowned medical journal, Frontiers in Human Neuroscience or something. Yeah, and so this is, I found it very bold, and of course it could not go entirely unnoticed sooner or later, so they had to retract that paper. But yeah, this is sometimes science works like this. Okay. The next peculiar consciousness-related enigma concerns near-death experiences. Janice Holland has already lectured on them. I'd just like to highlight here that complex conscious experiences, awareness, even very heightened state of lucidity and memory can occur even in cases of severe impairment of brain functions, for example, after cardiac arrest. It's not known how that really can be explained at present, in my opinion. And then we also find out-of-body experiences as a rather frequent component of near-death experiences. And there are very interesting cases in which the patients described apparently veridical perceptions of their surroundings during the near-death experience, or even of events at a distance. I'm sure that Jen Holden will have talked about these aspects of NDEs. Then another issue that I find very interesting are the so-called cases of the reincarnation type. Ian Stevenson has done much to promote research into these cases. Typically, they concern little children who, as soon as they start to speak and develop themselves, claim that they have lived before. And in ideal cases, these claims that they make about their former life can be verified, and indeed it can be confirmed that such a person did live at the place at the time that the little children claim. So Alan Doerr Haraldsson and Jim Tucker, they are among the many researchers who follow these cases up. And here you can see James Leininger. This is a famous case from the US. Jim Tucker has also worked on that case. And here this little James Leininger claimed to have lived earlier as another James who died in a plane crash in the Second World War. And as a little child, he already drew all these types of pictures. And this life could be verified. This James did indeed exist. And here you can see he visits a former friend of his who was still living, and yeah, seems also to recognize him and so on. So this is also documented in the book. And yeah. Now, regardless if we interpret the cases of the reincarnation type as evidence for the reincarnation and the survival of the human soul, or if we interpret it in like living agent psi or super psi, Stephen Brody will certainly talk about these cases also in his talk next week. So regardless how we interpret these cases, I think it's still safe to assume that some cases are veridical and have happened as they were researched and described. So we must assume that the memories of that former person, or regarding that former person, must somehow have persisted, and persisted without a brain, which is a very important finding in my opinion. Then there are also very peculiar phenomena that are related to mental states and their effect on bodies. For example, in the context of near-death experiences, Penny Sartori has described a very interesting case. It concerned a 63-year-old man who suffered from a cerebral palsy. That means since childhood, he had a permanently paralyzed hand, and he also limped, and these defects were due to respective defects in his brain. This is the cause of cerebral palsy. It's a brain defect, basically, that results in these problems. And after this very intensive near-death experience that this man has had, he was healed peculiarly, and he could, for the first time in his life, move his hand. His limping had gone, and this is, of course, very, very strange. And it can only mean that in this case, also the brain must, in that case, somehow have been restructured, because otherwise that could not have been possible. And as far as I understand it, Penny Sartori also followed that case up as good as she could, asked the relatives of the man and his physiotherapist and so on. And they all confirmed that this man always had this cerebral palsy, and there was no way that he could ever get rid of it just like that. Other bodily phenomena that are seemingly related to a mental state of somebody are found in the mental disorder called dissociative identity disorder. So, or in earlier days, it was also called multiple personality disorder. In that case, people have different split personalities that can alter. So maybe or they can change if one split personality has only one always has the lead over the present interaction with the surroundings. And what is now interesting, that the different split personalities of such a patient, they can display very different bodily properties regarding allergies, for example, if split personality A can display an allergy against, let's say, oranges, and now if he eats an orange, the allergy symptoms will break out. If the split personality changes, the allergies will disappear. If it changes again, allergy will reappear, and so on. And similar effects can also be found in hypnosis. People can develop symptoms of allergies, but also burn marks, just because they are. It was suggested to them on a hypnotic level that the body should display it, and the medical record also knows of several very unusual healings that were mediated via hypnosis, and also we know several other very strange bodily changes elicited via hypnosis, such as, I bring one more example here, stigmata. In that case, it concerns a certain woman named Elisabeth. Physician Dr. Lechler induced these stigmata via hypnosis. He could make her cry blood tears, and he could make her develop open wounds on her forehead that are supposed to correspond to Jesus' thorn crown, and also stigmata on hands and feet. And she was under constant observation after the suggestions, and people observed how the wounds developed over the course of a few hours. And to top it all, I bring that slide because it actually goes one step ahead. It concerns the sudden whitening of hair. And it is, why do I bring it now at the end of my bodily phenomena selection? Because it actually concerns dead matter. And this is what makes it double strange. Yeah. Now I got a little hanger. Medical scientists typically say that the sudden whitening of hair due to emotional trauma or stress simply cannot occur because hair is dead matter, because it has no physiology, so it cannot change its color. But still, maybe you've also heard it here and there, people every now and then report, well, they've heard a story about somebody who has whose hair had suddenly changed due to a sudden emotional trauma. And so I said, well, maybe it's also worth having a look into the medical literature. And this is now what I did. And in a rather extensive literature survey, I found 212 cases in the medical literature alone that concern patients who, according to the physicians, suddenly changed the color of their hair due to emotional traumas. And among these cases, there are even 46 first-hand cases in which the physicians observed the color change happening in person. This is one example, one of the best documented cases. It was described by a former director of the Medical University Hospital in Frankfurt. And this man, in the course of, in one night, he allegedly turned white on his hair, and also his skin, his entire body skin turned white, was depigmented within one night. Then he was administered into a hospital, and in that hospital, the people observed how also his eyebrows, his lashes, his other body hair, pubic hair, axillary hair turned white within the next 3 weeks. Just one example out of many. And this is also interesting. It's not from the medical literature, but I found 2 cases according to which also animals turned the colors of their hair into white. In this case, a horse. A plane was attempting to land on the meadow where this horse was grazing, and it almost touched its back. And so the horse went crazy, panicked, and ran away. And it was found 3 days later, hiding somewhere. And the black mane had, in that case, allegedly turned white. And the tail, the black tail, turned gray. That's what the record says. Don't know if it's true. And in the meantime, I've also received 17 personal accounts of people who told me, well, my hair or the person of that and that hair of that and this person has turned white, sometimes overnight. So I think that does occur, at least according to the medical records. So The last slides really didn't really deal with terminal lucidity, but still I think it was interesting to talk about these issues. Why? Well, some deductions from the last slides are, and they are again relevant for terminal lucidity again. It seems that there is indeed not an exact one-to-one correlation between the mind and the body, not always. And just to recapitulate some examples, I think the memories that pop up in another child decades later, perhaps in these cases of the reincarnation type, are very important in that respect. And also what I just showed you the last slides, it seems that mind can directly influence body matter via psychophysiological influence. So the mind in these cases seems to be like one step ahead of the body. Okay, and returning to explanatory models for terminal lucidity. So yeah, I mentioned it earlier, there is no proof, no real evidence, but we have, I think we have good indications for the following assumptions. Can the mind override non-functional brain parts given the faculties I've just shown you in the last slides? It might be possible. Or the consequence of that would mean, does the core of the self remain intact behind the scenes of a destroyed personality, like in advanced dementia and in other mental disorders? Well, that could well be. What does that mean for the brain, and what is the role of the brain, given that would be the case? Or even the sensory organs. And in that case, in this regard, it's interesting to read that several authors already, not only with regard to terminal lucidity, but also with regard to other riddles of the mind, have regarded the brain more like a transmitter or a filter or a scanner or a means for canalization, not so much as a means of production of consciousness. And among the earlier authors who thought in that direction were Frederick Myers, William James, Henri Bergson, in Germany, Emil Mattis and Hans Driesch, and at present there's Pim van Lommel, and also Ed Kelly and all his collaborators who wrote two very important and interesting books about the mind and what the mind might be. Okay. And William James, he had this kind of analogy. He said, well, maybe the brain can be regarded as a kind of a prism. Like there's a white beam, a white ray of light traveling through the universe, if you like, and then it hits the prism, and some parts of it become reflected at the surfaces of the prism already. Some parts still travel through the prism and are behind on the other side, separated into the beautiful colors that we can now recognize, which can perhaps be equaled to our biological senses, seeing, hearing, blah, 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 that allow for a structured and coherent existence in our familiar space-time. And then we have the ultraviolet and infrared aspects of the spectrum, which might be linked or likened to the subconsciousness and subconscious, unconscious aspects of the human mind, and perhaps even those parts which are reflected already earlier that never enter our daily dealing and with our daily life, but may perhaps in mystical experiences or whatsoever might still come into play. So in that case, given the brain is really more a transmitter or a filter than a producer, that would mean we have a correlation between brain and mind. It's kind of a two-way process. Of course, the brain does influence the mind. If I drink a couple of beer, I get drunk, but perhaps also the mind can influence the brain and the body and can even override it in extreme cases and extreme intense and emotional situations. So what about the different options again for explanatory models? So first, if there is really no neuronal or material underpinning for terminal lucidity, that would point to a mind-brain dualism of whatever kind. But if neurological processes would still be involved and would determine terminal lucidity, it still can be the case, that would also be good news, because this would open the possibility to develop new therapies. If the brain is entirely decoupled from terminal lucidity, that would make developing new therapies difficult. But no, future will hopefully tell. But as a third option, maybe it's even both. This is still also among the possibilities. So I just mentioned the future research possibilities, and this is now, I'm coming now to my last part of the talk. What about the future of terminal lucidity research? Several things are going on at present, and this is what I'd like to introduce to you. First, Alexander Battiani. He works at the university in Vienna in Austria, but also in Liechtenstein. He performs, or has already started some years ago, but he's still very active in that area. He performs a study on terminal lucidity in that he spreads questionnaires to thousands also, or more than 1,000 at least, physicians and nurses with a question: did you witness unexpected episodes of lucidity in patients with severe cognitive impairments in the past 12 months? And he has received many feedback accounts or return questionnaires. And among these are 192 case reports of terminal lucidity in different mental disorders, but dementia is by far the most often mentioned disorder. And then we also performed several statistics, because this is, of course, a nice body of data which you can do many things with. So the lucid moments in these described episodes, they seemed really to concentrate towards the period of dying, because one aspect of Alexander's research was to determine, are these episodes really concentrated towards dying, or do they just occur all the time during the last years, but they are just not reported because they're not so impressive? But that does not seem to be the case. Indeed, the reports all seem to say that it is strongly focused. Over 80% happen within 2 or 3 days before dying. The duration of the terminal lucidity episodes is rather short. About 80% only last several hours at the maximum. And then we performed, as I mentioned, several statistical tests, testing all different variables of the questionnaire that the people filled in, but hardly any significances turned out. That means that across all the different etiologies and diseases, disorders, terminal lucidity turned out to be a very unitary phenomenon that does not display a great variety, which is somewhat surprising. Here are just some 2 examples of the Alexander study. Typical Alzheimer cases, I would say, that involve near-death visions. Elderly woman, advanced Alzheimer's disease, didn't recognize nurses and her deceased children on the photo, which were standing at the side of her bed. One day she smiled at the nurse and greeted her and said, "Ah, there you are, my dear." And then she pointed to the photo and said, "Hans and Petra came to me at long last and to fetch me." And then she turned unconsciousness and died a few hours later. Second case, very similar. An elderly woman, again, she did not recognize her children and her brother who came to her to care for her, and she was mute. And her husband had died 4 months ago, but she didn't seem to understand or recognize that. And one evening, suddenly, she sat up in her bed, raised her hands. So it seems to be a very typical action and posture. And she exclaimed the name of her husband, and then she seemed to listen attentively to somebody. And she nodded and whispered, "Yes, yes, ready." And then she died. Okay. I turn now to a second study that was recently performed. We've just last year published a publication on that. In a Swiss hospital, we performed a study on end-of-life experiences that also included terminal lucidity and near-death visions. 20 nurses replied and were interviewed then. And this is also a survival-related issue, of course, that I talk about now here. Regarding terminal lucidity, 13 of the 20 nurses stated that patients with impaired state of consciousness up to coma awoke suddenly and shortly before dying, displaying unusual mental clarity. Near-death visions were also reported. 5 nurses replied to that question in this way. And specifically, patients perceived deceased friends or family members that they did not know to be dead. This is, again, something more peculiar, but 5 out of these 20 nurses claimed that they have even witnessed these special cases. And patients also reported having visited relatives living farther away, as in a dream, and they confirmed having perceived the patient as an apparition at the time. Also very interesting end-of-life experiences, and 7 out of these 20 nurses have apparently heard or witnessed such cases. Now, recent studies, part 3. In the USA, George Masur is very interested in terminal lucidity, and he, in the frame of the National Institutes of Health and the National Institute on Aging, has put a research team together of physicians who are now actively promoting medical research on a large scale in the US. And the background of their rationale is that in the USA, there are about 15,000 nursing homes, and there are 1.4 million people living in there. 65% of them have dementia, and 70% of people with dementia die in these nursing homes. So that provides ample space for research. And George and others, we have just written 2 papers, and in which we outline the medical basics for performing research into terminal lucidity. And this has, in fact, already resulted in 2 calls for research proposals that were just a few days ago issued, also here via the Department of Health and Human Services. It's called a study in dementia. And this now for the first time seeks to develop research tools and to perform large-scale prospective and retrospective studies into the fluctuations of lucidity in dementia diseases, and particular in Alzheimer's disease. So this is really, really good news, and it's really good to see that things are now really gaining momentum, and things are going, professional, if you like. Okay, and a 4th research project I'd like to mention was initiated by Renaud Evrard. He lives in France and works at the University of Lorraine, and he's aiming at developing a research network on terminal lucidity and other unusual experiences and practices around death. And specifically, he and PhD students of his, or one PhD student of his, she works on assessing the impacts of terminal lucidity on the affiliates. How do they cope with that when after they experienced such an event, and so on and so on. And because I've mentioned it earlier, it can be a rather disturbing and frightening experience, and it's also a pity if you fail to behave in the correct manner with a dying loved one, if you are frightened by in that case, for example. So that's also a very interesting aspect of terminal lucidity that has so far not received much attention. All right, I'm coming to a close with an outlook and some conclusions. Terminal lucidity, I guess it's an important but largely neglected field of research, but the good news is the research just begins. It's a work in progress, and we have very exciting times ahead. I'm very curious what the next years will bring. And yeah, regarding survival, it's also something that maybe offers interesting answers regarding the nature of consciousness, the role of the brain, and perhaps also, as mentioned, for the development of new therapies that might offer the option to bring the memories and the personality back earlier in patients, not only towards the last minutes or hours before dying. Other uses of research into terminal lucidity: it may provide comfort or help for the dying, for the nurses and for the affiliated. In a more general way, it might provide a better understanding of the dying process and lead to a better dealing with the taboo of death in a more general sense. And if you like, it's also some kind of a parapsychological success story. So the weird issue of terminal lucidity, discussed by romantic authors and strange naive dualists or whatever, has finally gone mainstream. And this is really, I think that's really great. And on the other hand, it also shows questions whether there is really a border. Is parapsychology really so different from mainstream science? I think it's actually not. Parapsychology is just concerned with phenomena that are unusual, that are rare, but it's it's an interesting science, and it's not kind of a pseudo-science and all that stuff. It's just particularly interesting research that can be done there, and there is no border between parapsychology and mainstream science. It's an artificial construct, in my opinion. Okay, and something like a takeaway message: terminal lucidity and also other near-death phenomena, they should not be regarded as an isolated phenomenon. They should always be regarded in or placed into a larger context, because only that will, in my opinion, provide the opportunity to develop an appropriate explanatory frame for the single subtypes of phenomena. Okay, that's kind of the credo that that summarizes the attitude of that research quite well. It's from Oscar Wilde. The ordinary gives the world its existence, but the extraordinary gives it its value. I like that very much, that quote. Okay, suggested reading: if you want to dive more deeper into all the issues that I've talked about, I can recommend that book very much. It's written by Edward Kelly and a number of other very interesting authors. Emily Kelly, his wife, one of the most interesting and important books on these matters that I know. And if you want to read some little more about what I do and publish, you can also go on my website. It's not on the very, very up-to-date, but at least the publications list is. So if you want, you can have a look on that website. And I've just also sent Nancy 4 PDFs of 4 PDF publications on my research on terminal lucidity. So you can certainly also check those out if you like. Thank you. That's it. I'm done. And if you have any questions, we can, of course, now proceed to this part of the presentation.
Well, thank you, Michael. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and I love the way that you wove both terminal lucidity and near-death visions together and other near-death experiences together. I think that's a great way to handle it. And as you said, the contextualization of this phenomenon into the wider scientific view of the brain and death and dying and so on. It's a very, very good approach. We do have one question so far. I think it was Adelson asked, do you know cases of near-death visions that were seen both by the dying and another person in the room?
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, I've personally not come across such cases, but there are several cases in the literature, definitely. And I think it was already quite early. Ernesto Bozzano, Carlos has talked about it long ago. He was one of the first who kind of developed a classification of different near-death vision types. And one of these subtypes that Bozzano created was collective near-death visions. And even there are different subtypes. Sometimes the dying does not see the appearing apparitions, but only those that are at his bedside. Sometimes all see it, and so on. So yes, there are several published cases in the literature.
Patricia is saying, my mother witnessed terminal lucidity. A close friend had brain cancer, didn't recognize anyone for weeks. Then minutes before his death, he looked up at my mom and said, "Hello, Anne," and died. So I think these things are quite a bit more common than we have ever thought. And I think that's one thing that your presentation really points out, is that this is very much a common experience, which often happens with parapsychological phenomena, right? Everybody thinks they're totally rare and unusual, and they're just happening all the time. Brian Williams says, a very clear and concise overview of terminal lucidity and related phenomena. Many thanks. Lisa asked, have patients woken up and requested certain foods before they pass away? Like suddenly being lucid and wanting ice cream, for example.
Well, I don't know about ice cream, but I know that many nurses have reported that. So in some, also in the Swiss hospital, this was very well known, and they say they have even a word for it. I don't know how it's in English, but yes, it's like the death meal. So if somebody who was very, very weak and disordered for a prolonged period of time suddenly asks for something to eat, and much to eat, then the nurses typically already know, oh, maybe this person will be dying soon.
Yeah.
It seems to be actually somehow also typical. One of the typical symptoms that may occur shortly before dying, or one day or a few hours before.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
In the research project that you're doing, that's quite a process to get the National Institutes of Health or Aging to sit up and notice a proposal. It takes a lot. It's almost like it's almost as extensive a project as completing the final proposal. So I really congratulate you on getting that far with the topic. I think that's a really positive new avenue, probably hopefully for finding more cases and finding more information and being able to publish in mainstream areas and so on, to get this make the particular phenomena more available to people and more known among scientists and physicians. I think that's just fantastic.
Yeah, and credits really go to George Mashur in that case. I was only marginally involved.
Well, kudos to him.
Yeah, that's really great that he took up the initiative and formed that team around him, and they really get things going now. That's great.
Yeah. That's an accomplishment in itself, just getting a write back from those guys. Patricia is saying, is there a leading theory on where memories are stored if they're not stored in the brain itself?
Yeah. I think there are speculations, but not more. Some say it might be stored in a non-local aspect of space-time. Some might say into quantum interrelations of whatever. But I don't know. I think all that we have are speculations.
Yeah.
And all these speculations are not well funded. So it must be somewhere. but I'm not even sure that we can find a really logical answer to that question. Maybe that's something like quantum physics or some aspects of the theories of relativity, where our human logic simply does not suffice anymore.
Yeah,
I am prepared that for the fact that there are several aspects of our world and of our universe cannot be explained with monocausal logical chains and our logical thinking, which is really designed to make our living in our familiar surroundings. But I don't know if we'll ever come up with a sound answer to the question, for example, where is memory if it's not in the brain? I think it's a very, very difficult question and difficult answer.
Yeah, exactly. Elaine is asking, I also have patients who want to dress to get ready for their journey, or they want to hold the people. Hold you, Elaine? I'm not sure if that's an English word, if you're saying they want to come into contact with the people around them. But have you heard of any of these types of, holiday, for their journey or holiday that they think is coming up?
Yes. I've also heard of these cases, yes.
Interesting.
They start to prepare, they may want to pack their bags and they want to dress nicely, yes. I did hear also of these cases.
That's fascinating. Marla was saying that that the Heart Math Institute here in the States says that emotional memories are stored in the heart. But it's interesting how these visions happen by expectations. Patients are getting visions of the afterlife when they die, or of the living world when they survive an NDE. Marla said she's had 9 NDEs and experienced visions of both kinds, but it's only one experience, and it makes me wonder if all kinds of lucidity on death's door have a similar process, may work the same, or similar characteristic.
I can imagine that they have a similar characteristic, yeah.
They certainly sound very much related.
Yeah.
It's one of the outcomes of I'm old enough that I remember when Kubler-Ross was first writing about death and dying back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, the kind of anger and dismissal that people had for that kind of work, because it seemed like 40, 50 years ago, the idea was, okay, well, we'll just get through this process with this person, but God forbid we should ask any questions about how it happens, or especially on the emotional side, it was pretty much taboo to talk about it. And I think it's wonderful how not only for phenomena that touch on our interests from the side of parapsychology, but just generally how the whole process has been understood to the extent that when a family is going through that process, whether you're having, visiting nurses, or a hospice service, or your loved one is in a nursing home or whatever, people can tell you what's happening and what to expect, and the nurses and doctors are a bit more aware of what the timeline is because of the things that they're seeing, not just physically, but also in terms of experiences and emotionally, and what's being talked about and things like this. I think that's a wonderful thing, that we're not trying to run away from this very normal, very common, totally common experience of life, that we're able now to kind of grapple with some of the stages in a way that better serves not only the person who's passing away, but also the family around them.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Janina saying, a dying friend of mine was telling the telling the invisible people she was perceiving that she's coming and would be there soon. And I think that's very common, isn't it?
That's kind of a typical near-death vision.
Yeah.
That's really, well, I don't know if it's common. Common is a relative term, but it's, if you say in percentages, how many of 100 people who die, how many do have it? I don't know, maybe 5. I don't know. But in a general sense, people do experience these types quite regularly in a very similar type.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. Folks who've been in this course for a long time, because we've been doing ParaMOOC now for 5 years, know the story that I pop up with periodically, which was related to us by a close friend of ours in Puerto Rico, who was visiting an aunt who had been in a coma And when she brought her new husband with her to visit her aunt who'd been in the hospital for this long of a time, and they were expecting her to pass away relatively soon. And when they came into the room, the aunt sat up and began a conversation with some people that neither our friend or her new husband could see, and then proceeded to introduce the new husband to these people that she could see. And once all of, and said to them, well, say hello to Aunt so-and-so and Uncle so-and-so. So they did that. And once this kind of conversation sort of dwindled, she fell back onto the pillows and returned to the coma and didn't wake until she passed away not too long later. So there's lots of these stories out there. Yeah, it is. It really is. Yeah. Any more questions or comments, folks? I was letting them know that I'll be uploading your PDFs to the course room later today, so they'll be available to everybody. And we'll also put them in the Google Doc folder that we're going to use for the course as well, for some folks who are having difficulty finding things in the schedule.
Okay.
Patricia is saying, thank you so much for sharing with us. I know Carlos and I are first, I love the idea of seeing you in person and hearing you talk after all of these years that you've been collaborating with Carlos. So that's a wonderful experience. But it's also such a very important topic, and I think this was a really good way to pull it together and show the different categories and what's going on in the brain and so on, and then foreshadow what may be coming next. So I think this is just marvelous. You're getting a lot of virtual applause in the chat box at the moment.
Thank you. So applause also to you, so that you stick with me and stayed with me with my rather long and convoluted talk. So
oh no, it was
thank you very
organized.
much for your attention and support.
Yeah, no, it was perfectly organized. It was really, really well done. So thank you everybody for coming today, and thank you again, Michael. It was a wonderful presentation, very informative and just fascinating. So thank you so much for saying yes.
Thanks to you.
Bye guys, have a great day, morning, afternoon, evening.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.